But what I did today, I thought we would do is I'll talk a little bit about Caesar and also a little bit about to understand how the court systems worked in those days, because it's very different from what we're used to today. And that has confused historians for many decades. And then I pulled out some of the original, which I made copies of, and then I put transcription on the back. So you don't have to try to decipher this handwriting. But Caesar Vandover filed in 1772, but he was not the first. There were about a half a dozen before him, starting from Jenny Slew, you may have heard of her. She filed in 1766. But all of the people who filed before Caesar filed on the basis of their maternal descent. They all claimed that their mother was a white woman or that their mother was a Native American. And at that time, children of Native Americans could not be legally enslaved by this point in time. And descent or enslavement was from the mother. So most of these cases were handled but they were, let's start over. In Essex County, there was a court of common pleas, which was a civil case. And all of these cases were civil cases because, of course, under the law, slavery was legal. So they filed what was called a writ, and they claimed basically false imprisonment. Right? But there was, the court systems in those days was not like today. You had to have everything very specifically stated, a lot of boilerplate language. So you had to say when this date of false imprisonment began, that you were seized and held, you had to use actual specific words. And that, so people have often read these documents and said, oh, well, she was free until, like I've read, Jenny Slew was a free woman until this man captured her and enslaved her. Well, that's what this document says, but that's not actually what happened. She had, so the difference for Caesar was he did not claim maternal descent. He was actually a captive who had been brought to Boston and bought off of a slave ship when he was about 11 years old by a man who lived in Middleton, who was kind of notorious for, he was in the business, basically, of buying people off the boat and then reselling later. So he, in time, he had Caesar for 3 years, and then sold him to a man named Edward Hickham, who trained Caesar on how to be a leather dresser, it was called, but basically taking a skin, a hide, and it was a very dirty, ugly job, and turning it into leather that could be used to make something. And if you know anything about the leather industry in Peabody, you know it's a dirty, smelly, dangerous business. And at that time, it wasn't done. A lot of farmers might even have a little spot in the corner of their land because they wanted it as far away as possible. They were just starting to do things on a more, not as an individual farmer, but as a business. So Caesar was trained on how to do this. But he wanted to be free. He had a skill, he felt like, and he could use it to support himself. So what he did was he approached a man he knew, who lived in Reading, and said, if you will buy me from Edward Hickham, then I will, and let me work independently, I will, for 6 years, pay you the cost of buying me. And the man agreed to it. And it worked. Caesar got to live separately, got to live by himself. He actually rented a house. Then the problem is he had a problem right off the bat because the man wanted the house without rent to an captive, and he wouldn't rent to an enslaved man. So Caesar formed a partnership with a white man, and the two of them tried to rent the house. And even then, the owner wouldn't do it until he had talked to Caesar's owner. So that was, and then Caesar had an altercation of some kind with his former owner. And apparently they exchanged very tough words, and Caesar was hauled into the justice of the peace and fined, and his new owner had to come in and pay the fine. So now Caesar had a problem with renting his house, he had a problem with being hauled into court for having an argument. I don't know if it got physical, there's some indications it might have, it's not clear. And his owner's not very happy with him. I haven't even started making any money off of you, and you're costing me even more. So they had a big argument about it, and Caesar said, no, don't worry about it, it's all gonna work out fine. First year it did. The second year, there was a disaster in the making of the leather. Something went wrong in the process, and what I don't know is, was it an error, was it just a natural accident, or was there sabotage? Because he was working with in a yard that did this kind of work. And what I don't know is, did other white workers sabotage these? There's nothing in the court records that would tell us that. But it meant that Caesar lost money that year. He wasn't able to make his payment, but it didn't seem to be a problem because he went back to shop in Salem where the shop owner he purchased hides and he resold them to people who were going to turn them into leather. And Caesar went in to make the third purchase, and the man said, nah, I'm not doing it. I'm not selling you anything because your owner sold you. And so it turns out that Caesar's owner, his enslaver, his friends have been talking him into, this isn't working out. This guy's just going to cost you money. You're being a fool. So he sold him. And at that point, Caesar said, you've broken my contract. We had an oral agreement and you've broken it. And that was the basis that he took his owner to court, which is completely different from what had gone on before. And the argument was, when you made this oral agreement, you in essence freed me. All I just owed money. And so they went to the Essex County Court of Common Pleas, which is a civil court, and Caesar won. And then his owner appealed. Now, the court systems in those days, when you appealed to what we think of as the Massachusetts Superior Court today, where you just hear appeals. But actually, in those days, you had a completely new trial. And the justices heard all the evidence all over again, with one proviso. You could not introduce new evidence. So what had happened was that the enslaver, his first attorney, failed to introduce the bill of sale from Hercombe to Caesar's new owner. And that was probably one of the reasons why he lost the case. So at the appeal level, Caesar's owner hired another attorney, a new attorney, named John Adams. Fresh out of the Boston Massacre trials, big name. Of course, John Adams and all the attorneys, you have to understand, in those days, court didn't just meet in a building. It traveled. So there were 4 court sessions held in a year, and they were held throughout the county, one in Salem, one in Newburyport, one in Ipswich. But so they met, and you would go, court would be all week long, usually held like in a tavern or something like that. There weren't any court buildings yet, and anybody could come and sit. So if you had a case and you had you might go during court week and find an attorney who would take your case. Then, so this is what Caesar's owner did. Caesar had the same attorney he had the first time around, and his name was John Lowell. You'll recognize the name Lowell. This is the founder of the Lowell family. He was a big attorney in Essex County. A few years after this, he moved to Boston and made a big name for himself. So Lowell argued that they were going to have the appeal in November. And John Adams realized that without this bill of sale, he was in a lot of trouble trying to win his case. So he argued for a postponement until June. But they had already brought everybody in to testify. And so they decided to just take depositions. So everyone who had been brought in November to testify in the appeals case got paid, if you got your expenses paid, if you were testifying, and they signed a deposition. They swore to a deposition of what their testimony would be. And those in June were read in court. They did not have to come back. And we know this because in the court records, in those days, the clerk didn't write down people's testimony. It didn't write down what happened. Okay? The clerk would only write down who had been called, who had received a writ, who had shown up, and what they were owed for showing up. So we have a long list of all these writs of people saying, oh yes, I was served a writ, and here's how long it took me to get here, and you know, how many days I had to spend. And the clerk would copy all of this down in a long column of figures as to who was owed what. And that was the clerk's job. Basically, he was the accountant. He wasn't the clerk that we think of today. He was an accountant. But it tells us who was called to testify, and it tells us who actually showed up. And those written depositions, because it was an appeals court, they were kept. And they are existing today in the state archives. It's probably almost the only case I found where I had actual written testimony from people. Because the clerk didn't write down people's testimony in those days. There are no court records. They're not even tell you who was testifying for whom. You have to kind of guess who was testifying for whom. So, and all of this was captioned down up and put away for 250 years until it was pulled out in microfilm, and you can go down to the state archives today and look up the microfilm. So what I provided today, well, the end of the story, to give away the story, is that they won again. John Lowell won the case again, and Caesar's owner was required to pay the court costs, which is all those people who had been brought in. He had to pay it, and he cost him more than if he had not appealed. So it was a huge, it was like £25, which is a huge amount of money in those days. And ever after that, and that's what the chart I have shows you, that ever after that, owners did not appeal their case if they lost. And in fact, almost all of them didn't even bother to show up in court at the slave out. And I'm sure there are some cases where there's indications they made an out-of-court settlement, they worked for me for 3 years, and this kind of stuff. But mostly it was the slave would show up in court, and the jury would say, okay, the owner's not here to defend himself, so the slave wins by default. We give them their freedom, but no money, a penny. And I am sure that the attorneys for the owners were telling them, don't even bother. Look at Caesar's case. You're not going to win. Just try to make a deal with this person or forget it. So Caesar, it is my argument that because this was a large case and because it was expensive and because there was so much testimony and so many documents, because John Adams and John Lowell were involved, if that case, Caesar's case could not have been won by the owner, then the attorneys were going, you're never going to win any case. And John Adams wrote years later that he never knew any jury who actually ruled for a slave owner. Well, he represented slave owners 4 times and lost 4 times, so he ought to know. Yeah. And what I'm interested in is looking at what these people who have come in to testify have said, because this is how I know this story is only from these testimonies. What's interesting, how many are teachers in here? Okay. What I think is interesting is you not only have to piece together who was testifying on which side based upon what the testimony is, but you also have to determine you can look at this testimony and you learn something about what it was like to be enslaved, what it was like to have to try to win your freedom, or to even work for your freedom. Because, well, let's take a look. I have to go find my glasses. Excuse me? The clerk. So that's the excellent first question. Whenever you're looking at a historical document, the first thing you ask is, who wrote this? Why did they write it? So, and there's no direct testimony because it's only going through the clerk. Some of the testimony is using language that I know the clerk must have put in. Or the person was familiar enough with legal language to know they had to say this or that, or maybe had been coached by Lowell or Adams. So I thought we'd start with page 3, Timothy Russell's sworn deposition. And again, I don't know, that nothing will tell me which side he was arguing for, but he is, I'll read the first one. I, Timothy Russell, of lawful age, that's standardized language, the clerk probably just inserted it, testify that about the month of March 1768, Samuel Taylor of Reading, that's the slave owner, cordwainer, that's the person who he works in leather and building, and Caesar, a Negro man, servant of Edward Hookham of said Reading, were at my house. And Caesar then asked said Taylor to buy him, said Caesar, and told said Taylor, here you can hear the clerk, now this said, if he would, he said, Caesar would get the money he should give for him within 6 years. Taylor replied and told Caesar if he could get him, said Taylor, the money he should give for him within 6 years, then he said Caesar should be free. So you can earn the money back that I'm going to pay for you. The sum of money talked of was 80 pounds. Said Caesar also told said Taylor he should pay him for his trouble, as well as for the first cost. So I think that's the profit. He's telling Taylor, you'll make some profit off of this. Yeah. From the conversation between said Taylor and Caesar, I concluded the intention of this transaction was to procure Caesar's liberty. He satisfying said Taylor, as is above believed. The deponent further adds, that's the person, that's Timothy Russell, further adds that before this time, he and the said Taylor had talked together of joining to procure the said Caesar's liberty on said terms above related, but not finally concluded between said Taylor and said deponent. And further saith not. In other words, that's it. That's the end of my testimony. So this is, it's hard to say which side this would be. This is the proof that there was an oral agreement between the two. But it's also the proof that Caesar was supposed to make those payments and that Taylor was supposed to make the profit. So we don't know which side this fellow is testifying. But it does tell you, it's interesting that they had this discussion at Timothy Russell's house. And what we don't know is how did Caesar know, Samuel Taylor? Well, it turns out Edward Hookham and Samuel Taylor had adjoining farms. And so Caesar probably knew or had seen and knew that Samuel Taylor was interested in starting to make some money off some of it. And Caesar was bright enough to know that he could talk to Samuel Taylor into this deal. So the next is the bill of sale. The infamous bill of sale. This is the bill of sale that Hookham made to Taylor because Taylor went to Hookham and bought Caesar. So, and I'll just kind of give you, this is a standard legal terminology here. For consideration of the sum of 80 pounds, I think that's LM stands. There was a change in money at the time because of inflation, so there was a new issuance. So you'll see sometimes in the, especially in the probate records, the pounds in new money and old money. This is probably early money. That's why it seems like a lot, but it probably was less in the new money. To me, in hand, well and truly paid by Samuel Taylor of Reading in the county aforesaid cordwainer, sold and conveyed to him the said Samuel Taylor and to his heirs and assigned a Negro man named Caesar, aged about 26 years. Now, why they're crossed out in the original documents, I don't know. But it does, I don't think it's because they got the 26 years wrong. Because one of the testimonies that we do have, and we have it because there was a friend of John Adams, an up-and-coming attorney. If you were an attorney, you didn't go to law school in those days. You studied under an attorney. And one of the ways that you studied was you would go to trials, and you would make notes. And then you would go back and you'd copy out your notes, and the attorney would look at it. So because law was made by precedent. Law was made based upon what courts had ruled before, but there were no law books where this was all written down. So an attorney had usually journeymen who would go and court, take notes, and they come back and transcribe them, and that way they would know how the court was ruling. So we know from notes, there are notes that were taken at this trial, that the original purchaser of Caesar, when he purchased him off the boat at age 11, came in and testified and said, this is where he said he was about 11 years old. And I think the age probably comes from the fact that Caesar probably had not gone through puberty yet. So that's how he was close to, so that otherwise how would you know exactly how old he was? This is a captive of a slave ship. What's interesting is that this, I calculated that Caesar probably came on a ship that arrived within a couple of years as Phyllis Wheatley. And so, Phyllis Wheatley was 7, or that was the estimate. She was, and Caesar was 11. So they're not that far apart in age, and it's a real contrast between Phyllis Wheatley's experience and her story and Caesar's story. I think that makes an interesting discussion about the varieties of experiences. Phyllis Wheatley had, fell into practically a pot of gold in some ways, okay, in terms of who purchased her. Because she was purchased by a woman who wanted someone who was going to grow old, take care of her in her old age, and she raised her. Caesar fell into the hands of a man who was interested in the profit of it. So Hercombe says that he promises to sell. This is the same kind of language you see in land deeds. This is basically the sale of property. So it's an interesting comparison to look at this in a land deed of the sale of the land. And I'll defend your right to then against any lawful claim of any person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was in 1768. Now, Caesar didn't get along with Hercombe. So the next testimony is from Abraham Sheldon of Reading, Middlesex, that was the county. Testified that in July of 1768, so this is after the sale, Caesar was taken by a warrant for his threatening to hurt Captain Edward Hercombe of Reading in his person or estate. And the aforesaid Caesar was carried before Mr. Justice Nichols and found guilty upon his trial, and Mr. Samuel Taylor, the new owner, engaged to pay the costs, which was about £4 lawful money. And he said Taylor also became bound for his good behavior, that is Caesar's good behavior, until next report. So after the sale, and again, I don't know that we'll ever know what was going on, but for me, this says that Caesar and Hercombe obviously were at odds with each other, and Caesar now felt free to confront Hercombe because he now belonged to somebody else. But he must have made such a fuss somewhere or another, whether he actually threatened to hit him or actually hit him, it's not real clear. And his new owner, Samuel Taylor, had to come in and pay that £4 fine. And he was not happy. Samuel Taylor was not happy about this. Okay, so the next document. On page 8, I, John Foster, and Andover, testified that about the month of June, right after the Justice of the Peace, one James Turner came to me and asked me to sell him and Caesar an old house which I had in Andover. That he, the deponent, said he would have nothing to do with Caesar. That Mr. Samuel Taylor sent to him afterwards and desired he would sell the said house or half of it to Caesar, and afterward came himself and engaged to pay the said half house. After which he did and paid him £2 6 shillings. So Samuel Taylor basically buys the house for Caesar. And I on my website, NorthShoreSlavery.org, I have further documents. I didn't print them all, but there are further documents about this issue. But he wouldn't sell the house to an enslaved man, so he had to sell it to Samuel. It does tell us, though, that Caesar's living on they've made some arrangement where partnered, and I don't know how else to use the word to use for it, with a Native American woman. To the point where they're living together, and Caesar and she want to marry. So they go to the Danvers County clerk, so that tells me that they were living in Danvers in his house. And Caesar has to have the permission of his owner. And the permission is denied. So I know they're living together because Anna Whitford, I think she was down in infamy, lived for the space of 14 months within a few rods of the house where Caesar, a Negro man of Andover, lived in the years 1769 and 1770, and saw him, said Caesar, and Tamar, an Indian woman, in bed together as husband and wife. How did she see that? I can't get it out of my head. Her peeking through the windows. And further said that Tamar was generally reputed to be a person whose word was not to be relied on. How does she know? Okay. She also said that Mr. Samuel Taylor came down to Caesar's house after money, as she understood, and after said Taylor was gone, Caesar said he, meaning Mr. Sam Taylor, did not come so often, for he should not pay him any money, for he intended to sweat him before he had done with him. Now, it's not real clear what she's saying here, but what I'm picking up is that, first of all, Taylor's dropping by, and he's dropping by looking for some of us money. And Caesar's, at this point, not real happy with Taylor either, and feels that Taylor is coming by too often for his money. I read this as Caesar saying, you keep bugging me for the money, I don't have it yet. Give me some time. Also, I see that in Native American societies, curing hides is women's work. And I'm beginning to question, and I don't have any evidence, but what this partnership, and I think very well, I'm sure it could be romantic as well, that she is helping him out in some way. She's either maybe is a possible source for additional hides from her kin in the area, or it's possible she is helping out with finishing when she's not in bed with Caesar. Okay. Then there we have the denial of marriage, and this is from the Danvers town clerk, which was copied into the court records. That in 1769, the above marriage forbid by his master Taylor. So now Caesar's clearly upset with Taylor, and Taylor's clearly upset with Caesar. So.
There's also here, Tamar, it's not a name.
No, it doesn't identify her as a Negro woman. So it's quite likely that one of her parents was an African descent, and one of her parents was Native American. And I suspect probably in the cases I've seen is mainly Native American women or American men of African descent. It's a good, first of all, there are very few, it's hard for Native American women to find Native American men. At this point, there's a big difference in the gender ratios between the two. And also it's hard for African American men to find African descended women to marry. And there's an advantage to an African man because then he has connections through the kinship networks of Native Americans to other communities. And that's, you see, so it has happened a lot in Cape Cod. This was got to be issues, became issues amongst within the Native American communities. Tamar, we don't know, she's here in Essex County, she may have been all on her own. She may have had kinship networks that were far away. I've never found any more information about her. She may herself have been raised in a household and treated as a servant, and this was her opportunity to get out of that by partnering up with him. And so I view him, and I think this is a discussion that lends itself, well, what can we pull out of this? What can we have, this is all we have, these little documents, these little testimonies, and you have to build, you have to use your interpretation, your historical imagination to imagine what are possibilities for her benefiting and him benefiting. The next one, this is the writ. The ECCP, that's the Essex County Court of Common Pleas. And this is a writ, and it's an example of what I was talking about. They use boilerplates. It's, I think in a classroom, you're gonna have to get the students to zero in on the important parts and forget the boilerplate. But that Jeanne, about 5 lines down, then and there in our said court to answer unto Caesar a Negro man of Andover. This is the writ that's issued to Samuel Taylor. He summoned the court. A Negro man of Andover in our county of Essex, leather dresser, and a plea of trespass. That's the boilerplate language. It's he's claiming Taylor has trespassed on his liberty. That's but plea of trespass. There's no, oh, you've enslaved me. There's nothing like that you can use. You can only sue as your liberty has been trespassed on, just as your land was trespassed. Your ability to be independent has been trespassed on. That's why that term, plea of trespass. For that said Taylor, that said the Newberry Court of June 1774, totally false statement. They have to give a date and a place where this trespass began. So the attorney would just pick whatever he wanted. Doesn't have to have any relationship to reality. With force and arms, assaulted the said Caesar and him. Now there is again what people get confused about when they read these things. Or it sounds like that Taylor has grabbed Caesar off the street in Newburyport and enslaved him, and that's not at all. We know that's not what happened. It's just that that's what the writ, the language of the writ has to be used. If he didn't, if the attorney didn't include that, the court case would be thrown out of court immediately. So it doesn't, as I said, sometimes in these writs, every single bit of it is a lie, with the perhaps exception of the names and the ands and the thus. It's just the way it worked. In those days, that's how common courts worked. You had boilerplate, and you had to fit the case into the boilerplate. A plea of trespass was the most manipulable. So that's why the attorneys used it. Okay, and imprisoned and detained him and kept in slavery from the said first day of June to the 9th day of September. There has to be addending, okay? All of this is then boilerplate. And so Caesar's suing for 200 pounds. He doesn't think he's gonna get 200 pounds. Nobody ever got it. It's just a huge number. It's like a negotiation. We'll start, I'm gonna ask you for the most I can possibly think of, and we'll negotiate it down, or the jury will decide what it's going to be. These are jury trials. In the Court of Common Pleas, it's a jury trial. At the Superior Court of Justice, it's a jury trial as well, but there are 3 justices at the lower court and 5 at the upper court. And the justices really kind of run things. The juries are free to make whatever decision they want, but the justices determine what can be introduced into court, what can't be introduced, and whose testimony can be listened to and whose can't. And other enormities to him then and there did against our peace, that's the peace of the king. So a plea of trespass in this court system at that time, this is before the revolution, by trespassing on someone else's property or liberty, you're disturbing the peace of the king. You're, in other words, usurping the right of the king to keep everybody at peace with each other. So that's the real crime in the court system at the time. And then on the back, I think I produced the back of it, but the sheriff, what would happen is that Caesar, through his attorney, would go down to court, and they'd have to pay the clerk, that's cost a few shillings, for a writ. The sheriff would then take the writ to Taylor's house. Taylor, he would read the writ out loud to Taylor, and then he had Taylor, you have to come to court on such and such a date, and then then he had to take something, some assurance that Taylor was gonna show up. So frequently on the back of these writs, he'll say, I took a chair. I don't even think he took a chair. I think, you tied a ribbon around the chair, like, this is gonna be the courts if you don't show up. And Taylor would have to sign it or mark it with his X if he couldn't sign his name. And the sheriff would take that back to the clerk. The sheriff would get paid to have him delivered the writ. That was really the sheriff's job at the time. They didn't go around arresting people. If there was nothing that the sheriff could impound, so to speak, he was entitled to actually take the person and hold them until they showed up in court. But you could usually find something. That's why I think it was the cheapest chair. I saw so many chairs being impounded when I read all these. There's not a warehouse full of chairs someplace. They probably just said, or marked it in some way, okay, if you don't show up, I'm gonna come see this chair. So all of this documentation exists because of the appeal. Because all of it in the lower court, once the case was resolved by the jury, in Caesar's case, and the lower court, the jury said, yeah, Caesar's right, and the question is, of course, why did the jury say that? These are all, you got elected to the jury, or the town would appoint you to a jury. Remember, they met 4 times a year. So, you didn't go to court and have the lawyers interview you to see who should be on the jury. No. Every town got to send 2 jurors, and they would be the same jury through the whole court week. So they'd sit in some corner of the tavern, drinking wine, and there'd be case after case after case. And most of these cases, the lawyers would try to postpone it because they're hoping that they can settle something out in court. As they do today. Nothing has changed in that regard, right? So and also the attorney for both sides has to be there, or the person has to be there. And if he's not there, then the jury doesn't even hear the case. This is by default. And all that documentation is not kept. It's only when it's appealed that all the documentation, and you have to file notice immediately if you lose it, and you have to sign a bond, or your attorney usually signs a bond. He's gonna pay £500 if the appeal doesn't take place. And the appeal is gonna be whenever the Superior Court meets, and they meet twice a year. Once in Ipswich and Salem. So that's when you get most of the circuit writers coming out. The local attorneys handle the common issues. He owes me, he destroyed my fence, he owes me the money for the fence, he stole my car, and you get all these kinds of stuff going on. But the big cases that are appealed, then you get the John Knowles and the John Adams. Now they all make money. The law states exactly how much money an attorney makes. There's no, percentages. There's no competition between the attorneys as to what they charge. It's stated exactly how much that they can charge. So the attorneys want a lot of cases, and that is one thing that makes me wonder about John Adams. Is he taking these cases because he just needs the money? And they apportion them out. The clerk will know by the time court meets. The clerk knows where all the cases are and what all the. So if attorney has already had the writ and paid for the writ, then he's there. But the other side may not have an attorney until he shows up at court week and finds one for himself. And so I think John Adams is sitting there, and there's probably a long line out the door because he doesn't want John Adams to be their attorney. And he probably is taking in as many as he can without really, maybe a quick glance off, I can probably win this, or at least I'll get paid whether I win or not, because that cost will be charged to the person who loses. So I think he's just taken them. But he never took one slave versus case. John Lowell took 5. Why did John Lowell take so many? Well, it started with another case that actually I was in counsel, and this woman, she had been in Newburyport, she had been enslaved, her mother had been free, her mother was an African descendant person, I guess I'd say. And her mother had a document, or the city of Boston, and a clerk with a document suppositions, but I won't go into it. So she filed, and she had herself, her parents had been married, her grandparents were free, her grandmother and her mother's parents. Her mother married enslaved man in Newburyport, and she had gone to church, and John Lowell's father was the minister of the church, and he had recorded the wedding and reported that the woman was free and the man was not. So I think she went back to John Lowell's father and said, I have a son, they sold me, they sold my son to somebody else, I want to be free, and what can you do? And John Lowell's father said, I just happen to have a son, and he at this point he's only been an independent attorney for about 2 years, he's still in his late 20s, and I think the father talked the son into take this case, and John Lowell won it. Won that case. He won the appeal. Then I think the African community in Essex County knew this guy could do this. Because I saw evidence of people knowing each other, clearly both all going to John Lowell. So I think he got to be known as somebody who would defend, would argue their cases in court. And he was also training another lawyer, and that lawyer showed up. So there really only, of the over 20 cases, there were only 2 or 3 attorneys. My list of my numbers, but who took the cases of enslaved people. And I think why? Because they were known in the enslaved community as somebody who would do this, somebody who would take their cases. Because the enslaved people don't have the money to pay for that writ, to pay the sheriff's fees and all that. So I think they were known as somebody who would do it and expect to get their money back when they won. And John Lowell did win. So then, but so, well, this is a real interesting question. Why did this start? There's one supposition, which is that in the late 1760s, there was a big influx of, it was after the French and Indian Wars, and trade was able to start again. And there was actually a spike in captive people being brought for enslavement into Boston. See, all of a sudden there's more ships and there's more people. So now, by the mid-1760s, we're seeing those people as adults, or we're also seeing them having married, maybe having. So my supposition is that part of it may simply be circumstantial. Part of it, some people say, oh, well, it was because of all the talk about liberty and freedom and this infiltrated into, but you don't see that in the first half dozen cases. You see, my mother was Native American, my mother was free, my mother was white, you know. So I think some of it is just a snowball. That Jenny Slew started it, she won her case, Largo came in, people started realizing that we could use the court system and that there were attorneys who would represent us. And so if you could make a case for maternal descent, that you were not properly enslaved, that got the ball rolling. I think Caesar, he was from Andover, and there were quite a few cases from Andover. So he knew this was going on. He knew this happened. Salem Court, who married, was in Andover. He married Nancy Parker, who had Salem Court had been freed. Nancy Parker went to court because she was claiming descent from Native Americans. And Salem Court was there, so he was going to court. We have testimony, actually testified in Caesar's case, that he knew, he had heard Samuel Taylor saying, no, I'm not going to free him no matter what, you know, kind of thing, which he does testify. So enslaved people are going to court weeks. They're there, court week's a big week, everybody comes in, you know, so it's kind of like half holiday or quarter holiday. And I think a lot of enslaved people knew what was going on in that court system, so they knew that these cases were coming up. And Caesar realized, I've got something. I'm going to really work with this. I'm going to really fight this. Because he can't claim maternal descent by any means, which it means. There were later cases, John Lowell took one, where he then argued, well, we don't really know who this person's mother is. He's clearly not a full athlete. So we don't know how, he used the term mulatto. So he's clearly a mulatto, so we don't know, his mother could have been Native American, and he won a case on that basis. So it's, I think, my theory is it's a lot of snowballing. Now, other historians say no, it's because of the talk of freedom, and certainly when you get to after the war, into 1783, and Elizabeth Freeman's case, where she claimed she heard the Declaration of Independence while she was living there. The people, the white people who she's living with claimed that's what she said. So I can't tell you she said it. But that was the basis on which she went. She said, oh, I knew freedom was supposed to be everybody's, and so I went to court. But no one else before that ever said anything like that, because that wouldn't get you anywhere in court. And in Caesar's case, he certainly couldn't say anything like that. I think he picked and took. We don't know, but obviously he was angry. We knew he was a strong and forceful man, and he had this contract, and he wanted this, and he felt like he had been cheated out of his contract. And John Lowell presented it in terms of because Samuel Taylor made this deal, he in effect freed Caesar at that moment that he made the deal. And John, since there was no record of actual purchase by Samuel Taylor, because the attorney on the lower case had failed to introduce the bill of sale, that when John Adams stepped in for the appeal, the reason he postponed it was because he was arguing two things. One, Tamar should not be allowed to testify. Because I don't know what Tamar was going to testify to, but was she Caesar's wife or not? And John Adams argued a wife can't testify in her husband's case. People weren't allowed to testify for themselves. Neither Samuel Taylor nor Caesar were allowed to testify. You did not testify because you couldn't possibly be expected to tell the truth about yourself. And since you swore to God that you would tell the truth, you were, in essence, by allowing you to testify, the court was going to allow you to falsely swear. So neither Caesar, that's why other people who knew you or who overheard these conversations would come in and testify, but you yourself could not. So the argument was, well, since Tamar is Caesar's wife, under coverture, she's no different than he, she can't testify either. And John Lowell had to argue she's not his wife because they weren't allowed to get married. That was denied. That's why you see that denial of the marriage in the court records. Obviously, John Lowell has submitted this, they're not married. The court said, no, we're not buying that. That's why this other woman's in there testifying that she sees them living as husband and wife, looking through the windows, right? To testify that they are living together. So there must have, and I'm trying to imagine Tamar and Caesar sitting there in that courtroom, hearing his attorney argue that they're not married, and which they obviously believe themselves to be, and the opposing attorney arguing that they are. It's not, it starts to give you a feeling for what it takes to gain your freedom. What it was taking, he had to deny his own relationship with Tamar. He had to hear about his first owner, the guy who purchased him off the boat. He got to come in and testify, because you see that in the written notes. And he had to listen to all of that. The fact that he pursued it, that he pursued the appeal, he had a good chance of, John Lowell must have felt he had a good case because of that bill of sale. And I think John Adams knew that too. Although he argued, well, clearly the guy's a slave because he's black. Right? That's basically what was John Adams' argument was, clearly he's a slave because he's black. And the court said, well, since we don't know for sure, the justices said, we're going to rule on the side of liberty. And which is an interesting comment to make. So part of why historians would say it's because of this new talk about liberty that, and I think that might have been true in the case of the justices. They're starting to be uncomfortable with using the court system to support slavery. And that what happened, I don't know that the juries feel that way, because the juries are all property owners, or the sons of property owners, who are up and coming. And these guys are, they're gonna rule in favor of property owners, whether that property is a piece of land or a human being, except for contracts. These oral agreements are very common in those days. And here's a man who is not with, if you think of Samuel Taylor, he's not a wealthy man. He does own some property, but he has to sell it in order to pay the bills. I found that later on, he sold his property in order to pay off his partners. So he doesn't own a lot of property, but he's clearly trying to make money by running a business of enslaved people working for him, rather than a farm. He's not your standard respectable landowner. And he doesn't come from a well-known or wealthy family. So I think these jury men are sitting there going, well, oral contracts, that's really a basis for our life here. And we just can't let somebody, it doesn't really matter, okay, who he makes his oral contract with. He's the guy who will break it, he'll break it with anybody. So again, that's just my position, because we don't have any documentation. You have to look at what was going on at the time period, what was important to people, and what I try to do is not assume people had good intentions, not assume they're like us, and are horrified by the idea of owning people, because they're not. They're not horrified by it. In fact, they're kind of not real certain that African people should be free, because who's going to control them if they're not free? The owner, here this is a time period of households. This is patriarchy goes on. This household, there's a patriarch at the top of the household, and he's responsible for everybody in his household. Just like Samuel Taylor had to pay Caesar's fine, because Samuel Taylor supposedly was the patriarch of his household, so he had to pay the fine. So he's responsible for Samuel's behavior. Well, if an African person is free, who's going to be responsible for his behavior, and how do we know we can even trust him? So there's a lot arguing for not doing this. There's a lot arguing, but there's bedrock conscience. And I'm sure that's what John Lowell said. There's no proof that there's ownership, and this is a broken country. And on that basis, I think the jury was willing to say, well, we don't actually like Samuel Taylor. We don't think he's a respectable person. We don't think he lives by his word. There's no reason to support his rights here. And they're punishing him by freeing the slave. I think that's an argument that can be made. You can also make an argument that by early 1770s, there's a lot of talk about freedom. There's a lot of talk about, and people are certainly, some of the churches, some of the ministers are now talking about the wrongs of enslaving people. But there are plenty of other ministers who own slaves. We know this too. So I don't think that a jury made up of about 12 or so men are really going to be all major liberty supporters. But I think that John Lowell was smart enough to appeal to their sense of the importance of keeping your word and probably tried to downplay it. Certainly tried to downplay that Caesar had a fight with it. That was not going to argue in favor of Caesar. Now, here's a man who can't be controlled. If we don't let him free, he'll be running wild. And there's Anna Whitaker talking about, he's obviously immoral and she can't trust her word. So one can build a whole case as to what this might have been like based on what we know and what was going on. I think that the thing I really respect Caesar for is he put up with all this. He continued to fight for all of this. And he got his money. So, well, he didn't get the money, most of them get their money. People came to testify for him, I think, you know.
He didn't get any money.
Probably got, well, they find court costs on 25 pounds, but I'm sure a little most of that. And honestly, I have not ever found Caesar anywhere else. Part of the problem is I don't know these names. These names are really hard. These are, you know, names given to them. They don't identify people. Nancy Parker's an unusual case. I have a few others who had actually last names that they had taken. The woman Topsfield, her son had a first and a last name, Edward, last name now, and I'm thinking, who is that? You know, how did that come about? And unfortunately, I have some thoughts about it, which aren't, I don't think it was a happy situation that she gave birth to this child, because he's identified as a mulatto later, so I suspect she was forced at some point. And whether she gave her child the last name of the family, forced her, Parker is not, it's a well-known name in Newburyport, in the Newburyport area at the time. Whether she did that to identify what had happened to her, so this is the problem when you look at court cases, and I'm sure Ed's talking about this too. You get very little information, and you have to interpret based upon what else is going on. But I have always thought that this would make for, I have to talk to teachers to find out how this would work in classroom situations, but I think you can present this data and ask these questions. What does this tell us about what it's like to be enslaved? What does this tell us about how hard it was to become free? How difficult. And what does this tell us about the importance, about a community of enslaved, free and enslaved African descended people who we don't see anywhere else? There's almost nothing that tells us that, particularly in Essex County, which is primarily rural and there's long distances, these people knew each other and they helped each other. There's a piece in the court records of an enslaved man who talks about he was talking to Samuel Taylor about this arrangement that Samuel Taylor had with Caesar, and he was telling Samuel Taylor, I don't know if this is a great idea. Now, why is he doing that? That's another Salem court testified that he had heard Samuel Taylor say something outside the courtroom on court week. There are other white people coming in testifying. Clearly, on the testimony, it sounds like talking about the arguments between Taylor and Caesar, and Caesar's attempts to ameliorate Taylor. So there's not what was well, they were. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell because they're supposed to just be giving you the facts and not. And I don't even know. And I had suspected that they might be called upon. A writ would be issued for their testimony by one attorney over another, but it doesn't tell you in the writ which attorney, so you don't know, whether. And sometimes, yes, it seems to me that they clearly must have been testifying for Caesar. In other cases, it's clear that they're testifying for that. And the attorneys, the interesting part about this is one of the justices in the appeals court goes on to become a justice in the Superior Court who was with Freeman's case 10 years later. That where she's ruled, possibly ruled free because of the state constitution. But that was one of the very last cases, and that there are other people who continue to be enslaved after that case. I know probate records. I've seen probate records. Inventories after 1786. A lot of times what happens would be children would not be free. They'd be repressed.
What's happening?
But by that point, there are free. There are no enslaved always in the book. In Southern China, I did a big study on that a few years ago, and she looked at 30 years probate records and found this And I'm doing a similar study now, because Essex County is basically a similar sort of deal. And that's what I'm beginning to see by the,
How can I say no?
with the early 70s, you just don't see people in the inventories. Or if you see them, like Jeanne Pickering case, it's a good example. She's in the inventory, but then by the time the case, probate is actually finished, there's no inventory. This woman took her own freedom. Yeah, I know.
Understand this.
You do, and that's, no, well, there is. Yeah. There's nothing, I was gonna write it up. I'm afraid to write it up, I'm not the Colonial Society, many years ago, and they had their online, did a whole issue on colonial court system. And in there, they discussed what some of the rules were in regards to testimony, but the whole common law system, which is what they operate under. It's just an ocean full of problems and issues, and it's really hard to make it clear. But yeah, and when I wrote the thesis, I have a whole chapter on just how the court system works, why it happened this way. And it's, I think, particularly important, and what I really do want to write up is how these documents. They aren't things that happen, they're just boilerplate. Because I have seen stories that Jenny Slew was, pulled off the street. The man was there. In fact, Jenny Slew. Yes. You are right with that. It was all basically out of that time. I have things about Jenny Slew that have to do with the Salem witch trial from 2 years earlier.
She was Hispanic, and it would have come out differently.
I think it lends itself well to this song. And also, nowhere else is going through the actual words. I'm going to send it. It just. Is an excellent example where there is the word, the poetry. And there's a lot of work that's being done and continue to be done on that. But I think why it's very rare. And I think that teaching her is a good thing, but it also doesn't tell you really what a form of language is like. She even gives a very unusual, rare, extremely rare language. But here is Caesar trying to rent a house. Here is Caesar trying to make a deal with his owner. Here are people testifying, hearing these deals. And here are actual African descended people as like talking about when they heard it. So, and also here's somebody that he's working today. We would think of him as working class. He's a man who works with his hands. He does dirty, smelly, ugly, dangerous job. He can't read or write. There's never had anything about him. He disappears because there's no record kept that we now have about the way we have to work on these coach. And I think for students, particularly, there's a quote in that flow a couple of weeks ago during after where the student said, well, all we ever hear about is other Douglas or Martin Luther King. And I went, well, that's true. I bet they hear every year. Every year. This is an example of something who who this guy is. His temper is probably really physically strong. His hands, his arms are probably scarred with the acids. And they used urine to cure these hides. So he probably doesn't smell too great. And he's definitely going to be scarred. And he's going to be, they know that he's an African captive, so he's not a little bit everybody else. And has made these connections in all these different communities. So this kind of fact. Now, also, it's been written off only arguing for himself, he wasn't arguing for the end of slavery, he wasn't arguing that slavery was wrong. So, but I think I have shown that because he did this, because he fought so hard his rights and made it for everybody else.
Turn around.
And that is a way of being an activist. Where,
But
he is a fighting teacher, you know his right as an objective, and there's current,
they're
that's
all
why I think
always being
the slavery community and the free.
Why sometimes we're like,
because they
and major kids African American flag. But like, then it turned into James.
There's one
right into a place where they shine around.
There's a bill of sale, and the bill of sale says, well, yes, I'm selling yours, so is it. Yeah.
Jumped out of their, they were like talked to each other, they like, they were like clearly loving that.
Looks like 20 years ago there.
I was gonna stop down here.
He told me to update his photo.
It was like, it was beautiful.
I asked him if it was ethical that we could make him 10 years old. I actually thought she did.
No, it's not smiling when
Yeah, I think the gray looks great.
the teacher, like,
We're just trying to keep
That's my case for my.
yeah.